You're listening to The Inquiry with Chloe Hadjimatheou. It's 2002 in the small Eastern European country of Georgia, and in the capital Tbilisi, there's a wedding taking place. A young policeman's getting married. He's pretty new at the job. A year earlier, he secured his post with the traffic squad by paying the right people thousands of dollars. And since then, he's had to pay each week just to keep his position. His salary? $10 a month. So how does that work? Well, he's expected to make up his income through the daily bribes he extracts from motorists on the city's streets. And on this special occasion, his colleagues from the force are presenting him with a wedding gift. 3 days on Tbilisi's busiest and so most lucrative highway. This was Georgia in the early 2000s, when it was one of the world's most corrupt countries. Last month, the World Economic Forum published a report which spells out how damaging corruption can be. It slows down economies, creates misery, and it's endemic in many countries around the world. But what can you do about it? Well, you can start, as we have, by looking at Georgia. Because by the time that young Georgian policeman reached his 10th wedding anniversary, his country had changed. A lot. This week, we're going to tell Georgia's story because it answers our question, can a corrupt country get clean? If you're a minister in a corrupt state, now's the time to start taking notes.
Part 1. Corruptocracy.
When you grow up in a society that is corrupt, it affects absolutely everything from the beginning to the end.
We're going to start by laying out the challenges facing Georgia back in the early 2000s. For a start, corruption had permeated the very infrastructure of the state, something our first expert witness, Georgian journalist Natalia Antelava, remembers well.
Most of my childhood was spent without electricity because the energy minister was pocketing money that was supposed to be going into repairs of the energy system.
The underdeveloped creaking power grid meant that those living in urban areas could expect just a few hours of electricity a day, and much of the countryside was permanently in the dark.
There were children who died frozen to death because of lack of heating and electricity. We used a lot of kerosene lamps, and, I still don't get the idea of lighting candles if you have electricity at home. It still feels a little wrong to me.
And it wasn't just the electricity and water supply that were affected. Corruption even dictated what could be found on the shelves of the supermarkets.
I remember very vividly having to get up at 3 a.m. to queue for bread during very cold winters.
There wasn't enough bread because the agriculture minister had sold off most of the country's wheat. Back then, all the most lucrative jobs were working for the state, despite the fact that the pay was so low it was considered symbolic. Civil servants were expected to make up for the shortfall in their salaries by extracting bribes, and the public had come to expect that they would have to pay for everything.
You're driving down the road and you're stopped by the traffic cop who says, you don't have ecological certificate number 73-52.1. So that's it. You have to give up your license. And you say, well, can I pay a fine? Because that's often the code word. And he says, all right, then you can pay a fine. Or you're in a hospital and you need to get certain treatment. And they tell you, well, it's not available. And you slip the money through.
By 2003, things in Georgia had become so dire that everyone was fed up. But it was the rigged elections that year which finally sparked a revolution.
I remember turning up at the polling station. I wasn't on the list. My father, who had been by then dead for 7 years, was on the list. And then the numbers were fudged and ballots were stuffed and election was rigged and hundreds of people came out into the street.
The demonstrations were led by a charismatic former justice minister, Mikhail Saakashvili. 2 years previously, he'd made a name for himself when he burst into a cabinet meeting, waving pictures of mansions he accused prominent officials of buying with public funds. Now he was heading a new party. It seemed fresh and different to anything Georgia had seen before. And its main focus? Fighting corruption. In November 2003, he and his supporters stormed the Parliament building. The president fled and 2 months later the country held new elections, widely considered to be free and fair. The results were staggering. Mikhail Saakashvili's coalition won by 96% of the vote.
It's very hard. It's like we cannot do miracles. But at least we have to get very close to being able to doing miracles. And maybe it's possible after all. We are going to look into it. I'm going to look into it.
So convincing was the new president that he managed to secure the financial backing of big institutions like the World Bank and the UN. Now a team of very young reformers, mostly in their 20s and 30s, had an incredibly strong mandate and the financial resources to transform things in Georgia. Minister, if you're taking notes, that high level of public support and the backing of the World Bank are really useful things to start with if you're going to combat corruption, because it's not going to be pretty.
Part 2. Reboot.
First impression, to be frank, was that when I went to the ministry, that the building was crumbling, and this strange smell that was there was the first thing that struck me.
Strange smell?
Well, yeah, the sewage system did not work very well, which was also a common thing at that time.
Shota Utiashvili works for a think tank, the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. Back in 2004, when the reformist government was calling around trying to recruit all the fresh young talent the country had to offer, they asked Shota to join them. Sitting in his dilapidated, stinky office, Shota, along with the government's other fresh recruits, were told they had a tiny window of opportunity, just 8 or 9 months to start making a visible difference. Every official that had ever been elected in Georgia had promised to tackle corruption, but all they ever did was replace their predecessors' staff with their own friends and family. The government knew that if it wanted to be taken seriously, it had to act fast.
We decided to start with the reform of the traffic police. Why traffic police? Obviously, traffic police is not the most important part of any police force, but it is the most visible. And we thought that as long as ordinary people in their daily lives experience police corruption, they will never believe that the government is tackling the issue.
And as we heard at the start of this programme, the traffic police were notorious for extracting bribes. In a 400-kilometre journey, you could expect to be stopped at least 20 times to pay up.
It was so much part of the culture, it was like tipping the waiter.
The question is, how do you persuade people to change their ways if they spent their entire careers doing little else but extracting bribes? The answer is, you don't.
We decided that reforming that force would be impossible and it would be better to disband this entire force and start from zero.
Yes, you heard that right. Overnight they sacked 16,000 people, the entire traffic police force of Georgia. But now that posed a new problem. Until they managed to replace them, the country would have no one regulating the roads. But in the end, traffic accidents went down because, of course, the old police had never been very interested in road safety anyway. Shota and his colleagues then set about recruiting a new, much smaller force, And because it was so much smaller, they could afford to pay them far better.
And the first task was to make sure that there was a fair competition that was merit-based, not bribe-based.
The new recruits were given proper training and new uniforms, and most importantly, a code of conduct to follow. The shiny new force was sold to the public in TV promotions like this one. Then undercover agents were placed in their midst, and anyone found to be tempted by bribes was immediately dismissed. The message was loud and clear.
The public perception of the police changed because they saw something that they thought would never happen, that suddenly there was a traffic policeman in the corner and he or she was polite, and we had a lot of women, physically fit. And by this traffic police reform, we built a new brand, and then we reformed the other parts of the police to fit in the same brand.
The rest of the police were arguably even more corrupt. Many were in league with the gangsters who ruled the streets in Georgia. Kidnapping and drug trafficking were rife. The new government knew that pretty much everyone had to go. In the end, around 30,000 people were made redundant from the police force in total. They were given decent severance pay, and for the most part, people went quietly.
Doing these things so fast was one of the best decisions that we made.
The need for speed was a sentiment echoed by President Saakashvili back in 2005.
If reformers make compromises, if they wait for too long, the window of opportunity will be shut down quite soon.
Because corrupt systems are like viruses. Given time, they tend to adapt to new situations, and they spread. So the government not only had to act fast, they had to extend their methods to almost every ministry in the country.
You cannot reform a single sector without touching the others. If you reform the police, you have to make sure that you reform the prosecution as well. The courts, the education system, healthcare system, customs and taxes.
In the first couple of years they were in power, Georgia's new government made tens of thousands of people redundant. And because these reforms were all pushed through so quickly, while the government still enjoyed massive public support, there was very little resistance. So if you want to stamp out corruption, you need to be willing to tackle the entire system at once. You need to be ruthless, and you need to act fast. But none of this ensures that the old ways won't slowly start to creep back. To prevent that happening, you need to distance the administration from the public.
Part 3. The No Contact Rule.
I took a trip to Georgia to see how they had actually managed to significantly reduce corruption, since I had studied in countries where corruption was such a big problem and it seemed almost impossible to break out of it.
Our third expert witness comes from one of the world's least corrupt countries. Johan Engvall is a researcher at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. While he was studying Georgia's success story, he became particularly intrigued by how they managed to reform the higher education system.
In the most prestigious universities, you had to often to pay several $1,000s, up to $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 in order to be accepted to the program. And then, of course, also you paid to get the grades that you wanted. A very common joke in Georgia before 2003 went like this. A father, he went to visit a university professor, and he told the professor that I'm very worried that my son isn't bright enough to pass university exams. And then the professor just replied, I bet you $30,000 that he will.
So as with the police force, the first step was to sack everyone and rehire far fewer and better paid university staff. But they didn't stop there. They realised that they needed to do something much more drastic to stamp out any opportunities for bribery.
One thing they did was taking advantage of modern technology to minimise the points of contact between the public and state officials here. When they interact, that's when much of everyday corruption takes place.
A year and a half after taking power, they held the first government-administered entrance exams into all universities. and they employed radical modern security measures to ensure they were fair.
The encrypted exams here, they were sent to the Cambridge University's printing house in the UK, where they were printed and sealed, and then they were returned and delivered in police cars to the vault of the National Bank, where they were stored.
And then came the day of the exam.
All the test centers around the country were guarded by police squads, and also these closed-circuit television cameras were installed in all the test rooms, and then parents could sit in a waiting room and watch this process.
If it sounds a bit extreme, it was.
Almost from a James Bond movie. There were, of course, a lot of resistance, especially among old professors, teachers, administrators, and also some students were against this.
Some students even went on hunger strike. The cracks were beginning to show.
It was actually on a balance here, a knife-edge balance. Could have been easy to give up.
But President Saakashvili held fast.
The university exam started to have some real value again on the job market, and it was indicator of that there was a hard work and merits behind this. So it's been an important step to really change Georgia and become a meritocratic country.
Now that there was very little contact between the public and those in power, there was nowhere else for the money to go but straight up to government. Tax collection, traffic fines and other payments to the state were all done online now. And revenue grew so much that the country's national budget increased 12-fold in President Saakashvili's first term.
Main thing to sum up what's the result of our development, it's very simple. Georgia became a functional state, which has never been in the past, at least since our independence. And that's quite an achievement.
And that's it, really. Everyone agrees that the Georgian model was a huge success. Today, Georgia ranks 39th in the World Economic Forum's Corruption Index, above Spain, Portugal and Italy. But President Saakashvili's story doesn't end there. And his is a cautionary tale, so listen up, Minister. Time for our final expert witness.
Part 4. Let it go.
Saakashvili's case was a clear example how power corrupts.
Eka Gigauri is the head of Transparency International in Georgia. Back in 2004, she was among the first wave of young graduates to be recruited into the country's new reformed police force. But she didn't last long. By 2008, she had quit in disgust at the way the police were dealing with the increased numbers of public protests on the streets of the capital.
I was really shocked. I saw that police used the force against the demonstrators. That was not justified.
Why were people so angry?
When firing all these people from the military forces and from the Ministry of Interior, from the police, the problem was that the government did not give the chance to change their behavior. All these firings did not happen in accordance to the legislation.
President Saakashvili was in such a hurry that he'd started cutting legal corners. Had they gone through the proper processes, it might have taken months, perhaps even years, to assess each employee individually. And by then, the window of opportunity might have closed.
This is a challenge for those countries who want to be very, very effective when it comes to the fight with the petty corruption, because otherwise it would be the long process, and I don't know if it would be successful.
The growing sense of injustice among the population was exacerbated by the fact that, although the judicial system was free from corruption, it wasn't impartial.
It was impossible to win the case against the government. So nobody was giving bribes to judges, but then it was like self-censorship because judges were not allowed to issue the decision which was opposing the government.
Very soon, Georgia had one of the highest prison populations per capita in the world. Many of those locked up were guilty of corruption, But there was an increasing suspicion that the courts were being used against the opposition.
Very often the prosecutor's office and law enforcement agencies were used as a tool against those who are not sharing the same opinion.
President Saakashvili had become convinced he was the only man who could save the country. He was sure that if he lost the presidency, Georgia would slip back to its old corrupt ways. And so he began clinging to power, using whatever means he had at his disposal. And he had a great deal of power. Soon after he came to office, he had passed a bill transferring authority away from Parliament and onto the presidency.
So he had more powers to decide on concrete things. The main justification for that was that because there were so many reforms and so many things were going on, he needed more flexibility and more powers in the hands of president.
So he needed to do it in order to be able to push through very quickly the very drastic reforms he needed.
Yeah, and that was the justification. But at some point, the ruling party and those who are in charge of the country should think that it is not a good thing to consolidate all powers in their hands and to have it for many years.
It's very hard, though, isn't it, for a government that has pushed through such drastic reforms to know when exactly the right time is to let go of control and let go of power.
Yeah, this is true. This is a challenge.
Possibly the biggest challenge. You see, you need power and control over the system to push the reforms through. But then, there's only so long people will tolerate even a benevolent authoritarian leader. After 2 terms in office, President Saakashvili lost the elections in 2013. In the end, his fears were not realised. For the most part, his reforms have held in place. Not everything's perfect. A quarter of the population still live below the poverty line and unemployment's rife. But everyone agrees that Georgia is a much fairer and safer place to live. So can a corrupt country get clean? The answer is yes. And if you're still taking notes, Minister, here's what you need to do it. A strong mandate from the people, the courage to fire everyone and start again. You'll have to create a gap between those in authority and the public. And you'll need to bestow enough powers on your office to make it all happen. But most importantly, you'll need to know when to let go.
This edition of The Inquiry was presented by Chloe Hadjimatheou. It was produced in London by Estelle Doyle and Laura Gray, and mixed by James Beard. You can demand an inquiry via the World Service Facebook page or on Twitter. We're at BBC The Inquiry.